Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? I bet we'll have some more people wander in as we go. It's my pleasure to introduce Adam Jones. We're really excited to have him here. Adam is a visiting professor at Texas Woman University and a doctoral candidate in the Couple, Marriage, and Family Therapy program at Texas Tech University. I was quite impressed by the academic record that he's developed at this point in his career. He has something like five publications. 4 of those are first authored. Another handful are being submitted and reviewed right now, and a couple of book chapters that were invited. So quite an impressive record for this stage of his career. He and a number of those have been in the top journal in the field of family therapy. So it's quite an accomplishment. His research focuses on sexual communication in couples, and today he's going to focus on his dissertation research, which is communication processes in dyadic couples. I've invited Alyssa to say our prayer, and then after that we'll turn the time over to Adam.
Great. Thank you for the prayer. We were rushed right in here, and I probably should have said a prayer myself, so that was great. That's definitely a transition, having been at some state institutions for a while, so it's exciting to see. Well, good. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk a little bit about my research. I'm sure that you all will have questions as well. More than happy to answer those. Even as we go along, but hopefully I'll save some time at the end if you have questions that we can chat a little bit more about some of the specifics. I'll go over a number of studies and talk a little bit about my overall goals of research. But if something is unclear, or you have a clarifying question, don't be afraid to interrupt or ask any questions. So I want to talk a little bit about introduce myself a little bit. Some of you may have met my wife. She interviewed here last week, but we actually met in our doctoral program. Jason Whiting was a part of that. He was teaching us in our first semester, and that's when we fell in love, and he was the one that predicted it. He was the first one to, so we credit him for our marriage. It's really exciting. Before going to Texas Tech, I did my master's degree at Utah State University, so really enjoyed being up north, and I did my undergraduate at Weber State University. I did spend a semester here before my mission, but ended up never coming back. No hard feelings, though. I've always loved BYU, so it's nice to be back. When it comes to my research, I'm really excited to talk about how I view my research in terms of advancing the field of marriage and family therapy. Through my education, when I first was introduced to the field of marriage and family therapy, I really geeked out about this idea of systems theory, that problems exist between people rather than within people, that the way that we interact shapes the way that we view ourselves and we view our world, and I became really passionate about that idea, and especially researching that. I really liked this idea from Carl Whittaker. Crazy is always a two-person affair, right? This the assumption that again, problems exist between people, and we can, as we work with people to relate differently within their families, or within other relationships, that they can achieve potential and improve and grow. And so when it came to research and my exposure to research, that was one area that really interested me, was being able to understand the ways that people communicate, the ways that relationships influence growth and change. And so a lot of my research is focused on these communication processes, and there have been several different areas that I've studied this. One has been sexuality. Shane had mentioned that I've done some research in that. I'll talk a little bit more about some of those studies, but I think the way couples talk about sexuality provides a very interesting window into their relationship, and it can be a really challenging topic for some people to approach. Really interested in conflict discussion, had some exposure running research studies on getting people to talk about their conflict, and have learned a lot through that process. Psychophysiology has been a way to kind of deepen my understanding of communication processes. Not looking just at the verbal communication, but understanding what's going on within the entire body, within the entire person, that and how those bodies interact with each other, and not necessarily in sexual ways, but when it comes to communication, how that influences the outcomes. Collaborative healthcare is one area of my research where really focused on building collaborative relationships, helping patients and clients to be able to advocate for their health and increase communication in their healthcare practices, and then lastly in therapeutic conversation, which is where I'm finishing my dissertation right now. So I'll talk a little bit about some of those studies. So I want to talk a little bit about what I've done in research, what I can do. Sell myself a little bit on where my experiences have been. I feel very lucky to have had really great mentors and some really good training in some of these areas, and I'm excited about the potential to continue to grow. So one area that I've been passionate about is dyadic data analysis. I think dyadic data analysis gives us the opportunity to look at relationships, look at relationship patterns in unique ways, and so I've tried to explore dyadic processes within a dyadic framework when it comes to my analyses, and in a number of different ways. I'll talk about some of the ways that I've utilized this dyadic data analysis. The first study that I want to talk about is the study that I led on the role of sexual communication in couple relationships. The idea for the study first popped up when I was sitting behind a therapy room, sitting behind the one-way mirror, observing as a new therapist, and was watching some couples have some really hard conversations about their sex life that they had never had before, and I was really curious about the idea of what role the ability to talk about sexuality within relationships, how that influences other relational and sexual outcomes. So what I did in this study is I collected a sample of about 150 couples and asked them several questions, several assessments about their sexual communication and about other relational outcomes. I ran 2 dyadic data path analyses, actor-partner interdependence models, and looked at, does this have a pointer? Oh, no, it doesn't. I messed it up. Looks like it got dark. Okay, well, if it doesn't have a pointer. The middle is the pointer. Oh, that's great. Okay, that's very simple. Okay, so clearly there's a lot here, but I wanted to look at the ways that the extent to which people have communicated about sex. So the content was looking at various topics and to what extent had couples discussed those sexual topics in their relationships, and then also looking at processes around sexual communication. Right? Does the way we talk about sex influence some of these relational outcomes? Right? Is there support? Is there a pursue or withdraw dynamic going on? And looking at how it impacted sexual satisfaction, relationship satisfaction. And I also ran a separate path analysis to look at those same variables predicting orgasm frequency, sexual frequency, and again, sexual satisfaction as well. So clearly there's a lot here in these models. I want to zoom in on a couple of these areas and talk about some of the specific findings that came from this study. This first one was looking at for women, we found some interesting relationships when it came to sexual satisfaction. That the extent to which women had communicated about sex with their partner, that impacted their orgasm frequency as well as their sexual satisfaction. But you'll also notice here that their processes, whether or not they were positive processes in their sexual communication, didn't actually have an impact on how frequently they were able to reach orgasm. So some interesting insight there. That so even sometimes in supportive relationships, we might have supportive dynamics. We would assume that just experience in discussing sex, experience in that could be tied to sexual knowledge and other things like that, might have more of an impact on some of the sexual outcomes that we might see. Another interesting thing we found was some of the differences between sexual communication and sexual communication processes and other communication processes. So let me explain a little bit about what these variables looked like. We have general communication processes, which was focused on when general problems arise, right? When problems arise in the relationship, how likely is it that these specific behaviors occur, right? And so that was some of the partners are both able to express emotions. They're able to one partner pursues, the other withdraws. Looks at several other relationship dynamics when they communicate. This was the same measure, but it just asked when sexual problems arise, how likely is it that blank these behaviors occur, right? So it was the same measure, but there were some interesting differences in how people resolved problems, general problems in their relationship, and how they resolved sexual problems in relationships. And you'll see this was true for both males and females, that being able, positive processes in resolving sexual problems impact their sexual satisfaction, but it wasn't related to their relationship satisfaction. And the opposite was true. The general processes were related to relationship satisfaction, but not sexual satisfaction. This really stuck out to me. I was really curious as to why this might be, and there might be several explanations. But I think what I gained from this study was that being able to communicate about sex sometimes can be a specific and distinct skill that couples may need to develop. And can have, and oftentimes, whether that be in therapy or relationship education, we might take the assumption that if we improve somebody's, their general communication, that will automatically translate into sexual outcomes. And this might challenge that assumption a little bit. That might not be true. Certainly this isn't longitudinal data. It's a cross-sectional look, but gives us some good insight into some maybe distinct differences between the two types of communication. I want to go back to talk about some other studies when it comes to dyadic data analysis. I also ran a mixed methods analysis with this same data set, looking at some of the qualitative characteristics of how people communicated about sex in their relationship. So what we did in this study was I ran a clustering analysis to look at different typologies based on the couple's sexual outcomes, and we looked at we then analyzed their qualitative data based on the groups that they were associated with. We found four main groups. There were groups that were mutually satisfied. There was one group where there was the male was satisfied and the female was dissatisfied. Other groups where the female was satisfied and the male dissatisfied, and then mutually dissatisfied. And we were able to do a qualitative analysis, looking at what are the key differences in how these groups communicate about sex. another study that I used dyadic data analysis on was looking at the brain. So I think there are a lot of other unique ways that we can use dyadic data analysis within our research. This study looked at regions of the brain in recovering alcoholics, in collaborating with some people at Texas Tech. And what we did is we looked at how various parts of the brain communicate across regions. So there's some neuroscience research that suggests that when both sides of our brains have to work together when it comes to information processing and decision making, especially in the prefrontal cortex, that usually occurs in a high demand task, right? So we would assume that somebody who's entering recovery and is experiencing is continually confronted with alcoholic stimuli or things like that they might that their brain might work together. The different sides of the brain will have to connect a lot more in order to process information and make decisions. And so we wanted to use a dyadic data analysis to see if we could observe the different hemispheres of the brain working together. So what we did is we ran a hierarchical linear model and made dyads out of the different regions of the brain to look at the intra-class correlations, which would tell us how similar the activation in both sides of the brain were, right? So some of the interesting things that we took from this was those who had been in recovery longer, those who had been in recovery longer actually experienced the different sides of their brain had to communicate less. This was kind of a surprising finding, and it was a different way that we could apply some dyadic data analysis to even some unique data, some neuroimaging data. So being able to look at dyads as the unit of analysis, I think that opens up a lot of possibilities, especially when we're looking at relationships or other things like this. Another area of my research that I've been really focused on developing myself has been in the area of longitudinal analysis. I have been involved in several studies too that have been focused on some longitudinal studies and working with longitudinal data sets. The first one that I want to talk about is a study that I collaborated with some people at Utah State. I helped collect this data when I was a master's student. We would hook couples up to skin conductance and have them talk about a conflict area in their relationship, and we wanted to see what differences there were between males and females in their levels of distress over time, right? And I think what longitudinal analysis gives us the opportunity to do is it allows us to see change over time. It allows us to look at differences and see what changes. What things we can do that impact change. And so what we looked at here was the level of attachment avoidance. It says anxiety, but this study we actually just did attachment avoidance and relationship satisfaction on their distress, on the couple's distress levels as they communicated through these different discussions that they had. The interesting thing that we found from this was that men who were high in attachment avoidance, they actually experienced lower levels of emotional distress throughout the conflict discussions, which is interesting. A lot of times when it comes to therapy, we might assume that somebody who is avoidant shows attachment avoidant behaviors, that they might be bottling up emotions or they might be keeping it in, and we might expect that they would be experiencing higher distress. But we actually found the opposite to be true, and some of this might tie into to our understanding of the interaction between gender and attachment, right? Do our our socialized gender roles, does that influence our physiology maybe more than, in some ways, maybe more than our attachment? And there's some interesting questions that were raised from this. Probably more questions than answers, but there are several questions that we've developed from this. Another study I'm involved in that is also using this psychophysiology data of couple conflict is I'm working with somebody right now to take a sequencing analysis and exploring, are there patterns in the ways that couples experience conflict physiologically, and can we take a sequence analysis and identify some of those patterns, and then eventually go back and look at the videos and identifying what's going on within these certain patterns. By doing that, it's hopefully helpful to be able to potentially identify some ways that we can monitor and track client physiology in session, potentially moving more toward in vivo psychotherapy, psychophysiology feedback within session, being able to monitor that in the session and take note of that in order to make sure that we're providing optimal levels of care for the people that we're working with, that they're not getting too distressed from the session, because sometimes we might not be tuned in to our client's physiology, right? And I think a lot of times, especially developing therapists, might benefit from being able to recognize some patterns in physiology in session. Another project that I've been involved with as a research assistant has been looking at patterns of communication between violent and nonviolent couples. So what we've done in this study is we created a coding system for couple interactions based on their power positions. So some of this goes back to some of the early family therapy ideas from like pragmatics of human communication, which is focused on every human interaction is either a person either is put in a +1 position or a -1 position, a dominant position or a submissive position, right? And we created a coding system to code couples' interactions as they talked about conflict, to see whether or not one partner was in a dominant position or a submissive position throughout each interaction. And we're comparing violent and nonviolent couples. We're also looking at different types of violence. So whether it's female perpetrated violence, bidirectional violence, or male perpetrated violence, comparing those to nonviolent couples. And we found some interesting things. So you'll look here, the blue line right here, you'll see they kind of gravitate between a -1 and a +1 position. And this is, we find that couples who are nonviolent tend to there's an exchange of power. You know, one partner might be in a dominant position for a little bit of time, but as they talk about conflict, then they'll switch, right? And the other person will take sort of a dominant role. And they kind of, the power is passed back and forth a little bit more, where we see that the violent couples, which is this red line, one partner tends to stay in a dominant position for a longer period of time, right? So, yeah.
Is that gender specific? Like,
this isn't gender specific. This accounts. This is every interaction is either coded at let me explain. If the male is a +1 and the female is a -1, right? That would equal out to a 0, but if they're both at a +1, that's what gets us up to this
Okay. Okay.
this one position. So
Sort of a lot of reciprocal aggressive talk.
right, yeah. So it's exchanged back and forth. They both try to stay in this power position, right? Whereas otherwise, there's passing back the power a lot more. So certainly as we expand this analysis, we're hoping to look at some gender differences and see if there are some specific ways that genders communicate differently in terms of power. But some interesting findings there, and hopefully this can help us screen and recognize and predict some potentially risky communication patterns. If couples are at risk for violence, how can we detect and screen that and catch that early on? Because unfortunately, it's commonly missed, right? Another longitudinal, let me talk a little bit about some of the qualitative studies I've been involved with as well. A lot of the mentoring of research that I've done has been involved in qualitative analyses, even though I consider myself to be more quantitative. I've had some good experiences in this, and one of these studies was looking at people's lived experience with hemophilia with an inhibitor, which is sort of a rare blood disorder, but understanding families' experiences, doing qualitative interviews, looking at how families navigate a complex and challenging diagnosis within their family, and how they can potentially advocate for greater psychosocial care within their treatment. So that's been a fun experience to be able to talk with the families, hear their experiences, and present some findings there. I also collected a group of master students while I was doing my PhD, and we did a content analysis, a 17-year content analysis of sex literature in MFT and family studies journals, looking at the type of samples that are being collected, the clinical implications, the general trends in the research and reporting on that. That was recently published in the Journal of Marital and Family Therapy. And lastly, some of the other qualitative work that I've been involved in is tied to that study that I talked about earlier, is a quantitative content analysis focusing on how different types of couples communicate about sex differently. So I want to transition to talk a little bit more in depth about some of where my research is headed now and some of my current trends. Right now, I'm working on finishing up my dissertation, which is more focused on therapist development, and I'm very interested in especially communication processes within the therapist room. How do we help therapists handle and navigate difficult and challenging scenarios when it comes to therapy, and can we teach them skills in a way that is actually tied to potentially to clinical outcomes? So this is a study that I've paired with the International Center for Clinical Excellence, which is based out of Chicago, but I'm working with some of the researchers in that organization that are based out of Singapore, and they've done a study to look at how therapists can improve their ability to navigate difficult conversations with repeated practice. So what we found is we had several therapists participate in this study, where they would watch a video of a challenging therapy scenario, and then it might be a client saying, I don't like where therapy's going. I don't feel like you listen to me, and I don't feel like I don't feel like you're being helpful. And and they would listen to this client, and then the video would stop, and then they would record their response, right? And what we wanted to see is how do therapists improve their ability to respond to these challenging scenarios over time? So what we looked at is we had one control group who, after they would complete their response, they would do a self-evaluation of how well they thought they did. And they would also go through and consider several points and consider what things they might change. And 2 days later, they would watch the same video and respond again, right? The other group received specific feedback about their performance. They would get specific feedback about whether they were being about their empathy levels, about their how hopeful they were about the client, about how persuasive they were toward the client. Several of these facilitative interpersonal skills that are important for therapists to be able to develop. And what we saw was that those people who received feedback generally tended to increase a little bit more. These are just the averages, but those people who just did a self-evaluation tended to stay in the same area when it came to their scores. But those who actually got feedback about their performance improved over time. So I think this has a lot of implications in terms of how we can improve our therapy training, how important therapy education is and supervision, being able to receive timely, specific feedback about your performance and in your therapeutic development. You'll also see here we had therapists rate themselves and how effective they felt like they were in their response. You'll tend to see that the feedback group consistently rated themselves a little bit lower than the control group. Whether this is statistically significant, we still need to figure out. That's what I'm doing all of next week for my spring break. But you'll also see this kind of supports a trend in the research that therapists who tend to be a bit more self-critical, probably not in damaging ways, but in ways that can actually be productive, they tend to have better outcomes because they critique their work and they're constantly looking for ways to improve and develop themselves as therapists. So some interesting findings there. I'm looking forward to furthering this research. And what I'll be doing on this study is I'm running a growth mixture model to look at different trajectories. Are there different groups or classes in which therapists improve, right? Are there different types of therapists and the way that they improve over time across both the control and the feedback group? And I think that'll help us tailor our approach a little bit and understand how therapists might differ in the way that they improve with practice. So with all of this, my research is very tied to my clinical work and also my teaching, and there are several ways where I really try to integrate my research with my teaching and my clinical work as well. The first, like I mentioned, I've had several studies that have really seemed to challenge some assumptions that people might commonly have about therapy, and that's really changed the way that I approach therapy, especially like when I mentioned sexual communication. Sometimes if we have the assumption that if we don't bring it up, if we just talk about general communication, that'll naturally translate. I'm a firm believer that if therapists don't initiate those conversations or don't feel confident in initiating those conversations, that can leave a lot of sexual problems unnoticed and untreated. when it comes to teaching as well, my research has been my research on therapist training has really influenced the way that I teach and train therapists. One area that I've developed, I've really tried to change in my teaching has been helping my student therapists to really recognize whether or not they're being effective, and that can be a challenging conversation to know if as a student therapist you're really effective and if your clients are really improving. So I have my clients track their clinical outcomes with sessions with their clients over multiple sessions and evaluate their own performance and identify specific skills that they can improve in. And so I feel all of these research areas and my clinical work and my teaching are really tied together in a lot of ways. So I want to talk a bit about why I think this research matters, why it should be important to BYU, and especially this teaching position, and research position. I think we have a long way to go in validating the practice of family therapy, especially in terms of our professional clout and lobbying ability. I think there's a huge need for being able to validate and enhance our clinical training and our clinical practices in order to show that they're tied to clinical outcomes. I'm really interested in understanding therapy interactions that can produce change, whether that's helping couples to modify their communication processes in ways that reduce risk for violence or reduce risk for divorce, but also helping therapists to communicate more clearly and develop skills that are crucial for navigating some difficult conversations. And I'd like to continue pushing for the tie between the training and the outcomes. How do we help focusing on the idea that we can that our training has an actual impact and we can feel confident that the therapists that we send out into the world are really making a difference in our helping clients achieve change, whatever that looks like. So let me talk a little bit for a couple minutes about where I plan to go from here. I would hope to continue integrating psychophysiology in the therapy process research. I've outlined several of the studies that I'm working on now, and I hope to continue building that and building our understanding of how our physiology impacts our sessions, and I've already mentioned advocating potentially for in vivo monitoring and helping clients to recognize their own physiological responses as well. So I'm interested in doing some research in that area. Advancing our training procedures, I've talked about that a little bit. Developing avenues for continued training and development. So also helping to improve our program of training beyond just graduate education programs, and helping therapists to develop their skills wherever they are in their practice. Equipping supervisors with tools for providing specific therapy feedback, and I don't know why. So when it comes to the therapist training practices, I think I was a little repetitive in this, but understanding ways that we can help teach people alliance behaviors, but also enhancing our ability to tell people to track whether or not people are adhering to specific models. All of these are some of the future directions that I'll hope to do. So I want to talk a little bit about how I'll get there and some of the things that I'd like to do with this. The first is I'd hope to collaborate with some other universities that have collections of couple and therapist physiology data. Clearly, here at BYU, there's some great research with that. Utah State also has some, and in Auburn, they're collecting some therapy psychophysiology data as well about the therapy process, and I think we can. I already have some relationships there, and would hope to continue capitalizing on those and building those. Next, I'm working with AAMFT right now. AAMFT just spent several $1 million on a video simulation software that they're hoping to get programs interested in, invested in, and I'm working with them right now to roll out some research studies measuring its effectiveness as well. So working with them and developing some plans in the process right now, hopefully beginning that in the fall to give AMFT and also us a way to see if video simulation can be an effective way in helping students improve and gain specific skills for therapy. Lastly, I'm hoping to continue working with the International Center for Clinical Excellence. I'm collaborating on this study right now. I've already talked with them. They're hoping to replicate the study in graduate settings, graduate training programs, and I'm really looking forward to that opportunity as well. And I'd also hope to partner with local sites, people in the university, and collaborating on some of this future research. There is a lot of funding in this area. There are several NIH grants. APA has several grants that are focused on research training in complementary and integrative health. So enhancing the training, enhancing the types of training and the role of psychotherapist characteristics on treatment outcomes. So whether or not these are grants that I think I'll get right out of the gate, I'm still pretty new to the grant writing process, but I hope with development, I think this shows that there's some interest nationally when it comes to funding arms, that there will be funding opportunities in this line of research that I hope to pursue. So with that said, we had about 15 minutes left, which is right about where I wanted to be. I wanted to open it up to you all to see if you had any questions or things you wanted to ask about. You guys have a great lunch. Thanks. Yeah.
You're doing some great research. It's really exciting to hear about. Thanks for sharing with us.
Yeah, thanks.
I'm curious with the psychophysiology work that you're doing. If let's say you got some of this funding and you could measure just about whatever you wanted, what would you ideally get? I mean, you talked about skin conductance. Is there something out there that you would just love to track with couples in therapy or with the therapist, or what would be your dream study?
Yeah, the dream study that I would love to do is to be able to track physiology through relational therapy sessions. So being able to track the therapist's physiology, being able to track the client's physiology, and see how these things interact, right? And be able, what I would ideally like to do is collect videos on all of those sessions, and be able to see if there are patterns in the way that people experience therapy physiologically, whether that's reducing the therapist's anxiety, right? If the therapist remains a calm, non-anxious presence in the session, if that's helpful for the clients, ways that we can recognize some of those therapy processes that we already talk about theoretically, if we can recognize them on a physiological level, I think that would help us to identify, one, ways that we can better train therapists to manage their anxiety in the room. I think that would help us to understand some systemic interactions of what makes therapy effective and how can we recognize when change happens. So I'd hope to, of course, also track clinical outcomes with that as well, and be able to compare differences in those physiological experiences in session compared to their outcomes. Yeah.
I'm not, just one follow-up question. So
Uh-huh.
I don't do a lot of physiology work.
Mhm.
Is there some cool gadget that you would hook up to them? Like, would you get their heart rate or skin, or is there, I don't know, like what would you?
Yeah, there are a lot of options when it comes to psychophysiology resources. I mean, there are skin conductance, and each of them measure specific different things. So usually having multiple measures is helpful, right? We want to look at heart rate variability. We're looking at skin conductance. There's also respiratory measures as well that help you understand their breathing and what's going on there. Those are pretty obtrusive though, which can be challenging for a therapy session. So there are some that are non-invasive that I think can be helpful. There are several companies that have developed and are developing. I don't know that the technology is quite there yet, but they have wristwatches that you can wear during therapy that will monitor some heart rate variability and other things like that you can keep track of heart rate through the session. And so hopefully as some of the technology continues to advance as well, there might be some less obtrusive ways to integrate that into the therapy room. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I feel kind of like a hypocrite asking this question because I use like class analysis and other person-centered typology generating type analyses frequently.
Mm-hmm.
But are there, I mean, you've obviously demonstrated the utility for those types of analyses.
Mm-hmm.
What might be the dangers of taking those analyses and applying them to therapy?
Well, there are several potential risks, I guess. One is, and I talked about classes as well. Our growth mixture modeling. I think one of the big risks is sometimes by classifying people, we are also limiting our understanding of information, and that can significantly narrow our understanding. So it can build and also narrow our experience and our assessment of what's going on. But I think that's one potential drawback. There are several others that are focused on design. I don't know that the design is always appropriate for some of these longitudinal analyses. Like I said, I've mentioned I've done one study with the psychophysiology feedback and the longitudinal analyses. Oftentimes, you just don't have a large enough sample size in order to have adequate power to run these latent-based models that you'd like to have, and so our big risk there is getting enough participants to conduct some of those studies. So there are some drawbacks, I think, design-wise and also theoretically that can impede some of that research. Is that some of your experience with that?
No, I'm not a clinician.
Okay.
So I just wondered, thinking about the work that I've done in terms of finding latent classes and all.
Mm-hmm.
It's one thing for a basic researcher to say, yeah, these are what I found and this is what predicts their class membership, for example, or these are the outcomes of different class membership. Right? To me, I wonder, is it a wholly another thing to say, okay, now we're going to apply this in practice?
Right.
And I wouldn't know. I don't have any insights.
Yeah.
So that's why I was asking you.
Well, it's new, and not very many people have used it, and so we'll see how it goes. We'll see how it's received. I'm kind of going out on a limb with it. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Surprised on your one figure with those like years of sobriety and
Mhm.
connectivity, the R square was like 0.999. I just have a hard time wrapping my head around it.
Well, so that was a so don't be too confused by that, and it's not necessarily as exciting as it might sound. It's just saying that this is a very nice, neat line. But the I actually probably should have put up the table. The level of, we can't really compare whether there were significant differences because the interclass correlation becomes insignificant later. The longer that people had been in sobriety, had been in recovery, and so this was our way of just kind of fitting a best fit line to that, but it can be a little misleading that way. We tried to not be misleading in the actual write-up of the article, but for a visual representation of how the interclass correlation decreased, there was less connectivity over time. It was demonstrated kind of simply over time with a graph, so yeah.
So great stuff, Adam, and you're doing a lot of interesting things, and to me, it seems like a variety of interesting things. And as you think about your career developing over the next 5, 10, 20 years, what do you hope to be most folks would get a big grant and just sort of, but you had to focus on something,
Mm-hmm.
and what would you want to be known for? What do you want to be your major contribution to the field down the road?
Yeah, great question. I think the area that I'm really interested in right now and where I'd hope to really stick would be the therapist training and tying the training to our outcomes. So at least for the next 5 years, I have hopefully enough projects in line to get me through the next couple of years and be publishing on that for a while. And I would hope that that's kind of my main identity as I go along.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, why don't we go ahead and give you a little bit more of a break. His teaching presentation is today at 1:35. None of our kind of typically available rooms were available for the streaming. So if you can't make it to the actual room of the presentation, it's going to be streamed to B92 of this building. It's downstairs.
There's not that many extra seats in that room either.
So don't go to the room.
There's 5.
Go to
5 or
B92.
6.
And also, the teaching presentation will only be about half of the total length of the class, and so it might be disruptive to have a bunch of us kind of get out of our seats halfway through. So if you'd like to watch the teaching presentation, B92, and it'll also be available later, recording of it. So why don't we...